here with President Santos, Juan Manuel Santos. So many of you have commented to myself and my co-president, Sophia Lee, and our chief of staff, Cohen, who how much over the summer people have wanted to hear from Mr. Santos. And I'd also like to thank Sabina Alcaire and Ana Marie Morales from OFI for working with us and making this event happen. Just a few housekeeping points. Alexa Cohen was a research fellow at the Aspen Institute, where she researched multidimensional poverty. So our questions to Mr. Santos are going to cover sort of two areas: his battle for peace, his negotiations and settlement to bring an end to the conflict in Colombia, and then more recently his book, The Battle Against Poverty, which covers his work using multidimensional poverty indices to bring down and significantly combat poverty in Colombia. It's just thank you again for being here. After Alexa and I ask some questions, we will open it up to the audience. So just say your name, college, and we're looking forward to it. So without further ado, thank you, Mr. Santos.
Mr. Santos, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. I wanted to start with your book, The Battle Against Poverty. The Battle for Peace. That your first book, The Battle Against Poverty. And you mentioned that, surprisingly, victims expressed the greatest openness to peace negotiations with the FARC. And I'm wondering why you think they were so receptive.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor, great pleasure to be here with you. It's a great pleasure to be in Oxford, and a great honor to be in Oxford in these interesting times that we're living. Why were victims, and why did they become so important? In many wars and in many conflicts, the victims had been ignored, which, after studying many of the different conflicts and different peace negotiations, I said, that is a mistake. And there was a treaty that was negotiated in the 90s called the Rome Statute by more than 190 countries, to try to help and give a legal framework in the negotiations for peace in armed conflicts. And that was the first time that the victims appeared. And in that statute, they identified 4 fundamental rights of the victims. The victims should have the right to claim justice, because they're victims. They have the right to claim reparations, to be repaired for what they suffered. They demand the truth. So there's the right to the truth and the right to non-repetition. No armed conflict and no conflict had taken that into account. But when I started thinking about the peace process, somebody came and said, why don't you start, even before you sign the peace, start recognizing the victims? We've been at war for 50 years. And so I said, I think it's a good idea. And we approved a law called Victims' Law and Reparations at the start of the peace process. That generated a big reaction, a positive reaction from many people, to the extent that the then Secretary General of the UN went to Colombia to be by my side when I signed this law. But what that did was put the victims in my side. in the peace process and become my allies. Even though I was at the beginning somewhat skeptical. I was said, do you get the victims involved? But the victims will probably be against the peace process because every peace process boils down to one simple fact. Where do you draw the line between peace and justice? How much justice are you willing to sacrifice in order to have peace? And the victims, because they are victims, would be hesitant to accept that the perpetrators have legal benefits, have amnesties in the case of the ones that are not the most responsible. So I was a bit reluctant, but something marvelous happened. A former professor, not of Oxford, but at Harvard, went to Colombia. He said to me, you're embarking in a very difficult path. You're going to be called a traitor because you were elected at the beginning as a war hero. You are going to have many problems and you're going to feel alone. And you need something to re-energize you. And I advise you to talk to the victims and ask them about their dramas. Talk to them. That will re-energize you. And so, as a matter of discipline, I started talking at least to one victim a week around the country. And the stories that they told me were amazing and terrible, but at the end, most of them said, but President, persevere, go for it. And I asked many of them, but why are you so generous? You know that the person who raped and killed your daughter is going to have some kind of legal benefit. Why are you so generous? And most of them said, because we don't want others to suffer what we suffer. And that for me was a lesson in my life. I discovered that the human condition was not as bad as I thought. And so the victims became allies. To the extent that one victim, her name is Pastora Mira, there's one of the students who's from Palmira, Colombia. It's very near from where she is from, the coffee region. Her mother and her father were killed. Her brother was killed. And her son was tortured and killed. And a week after she buried her son, tortured and killed, somebody knocked on her door, wounded, asking for help. And she brought him in and put him in his son's bed, cured him. When this individual was coming out 5 days later, he saw a picture of this lady, this woman of Pastora Mira, and her son. And he was shocked. He went to his knees and started screaming, please, 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 don't tell me this is your son. And she said, yes, why? Because I must tell you, I was the one who tortured and killed him. And he was going mad. And she took him by the shoulders and said, stand up. And he stood up, looked at him straight in the eyes and embraced him and said, thank you. And this guy was even more crazy. How can you thank me if I have just confessed to you that I tortured and killed your son? And she said, precisely because what you are doing now, asking for forgiveness and telling the truth, that for me it will mean that I will not hate for the rest of my life. You took the hatred out of me by doing that. That lesson, that type of situation is what victims sort of add to a peace process. That's why the victims were so important and are so important. We have more than 9 million victims of the war, 50 years of war in Colombia.
Yeah, you say how the previous presidents had tried to make peace, President Cohen or guerrilla, but why do you think the conditions were right during your presidency, and what did you learn from their failure to make peace that you brought to your presidency when you started?
Well, I studied many peace processes, and of course the peace process of my predecessors that had all failed. What did they do wrong? Or what did they do right? And I started identifying, for example, all of them had thought that the military would automatically be against the peace process, because in most of the peace processes, one of the most important items of the agenda is what to do with the armed forces, with the military. They are put on the table and many times dismantled, so they thought that because of that, the military would be against. Well, I was the only president who had been in the military. I was in the Marines, in the Navy, and I knew them. And I remember a phrase of MacArthur at the end of the Second World War, that they said, what you want is more war. And he said, you can be more wrong. The soldiers are the ones that don't want war because they are the ones who put death. So that, for example, was one condition. In the case of Pastrana, they did not prepare. You need to prepare a negotiation. You can't think that you sit down and just start talking and peace will. You need to know exactly where you want to go. You need to specify your red lines, and you have to make them clear. And you have to be willing to take risks and to fight even your own people that many times will go against you. That usually happens. In the Northern Ireland peace process, both Ian Paisley and McGuinness were accused of being traitors by their own people. Mandela was accused of being traitor by their own people, because you sit down with your former enemies or adversaries, but you have to do it. So it was a matter of identifying the necessary conditions to have a successful peace process at that time, because circumstances change within the countries and around the world, and the conditions for successful peace processes also change. So you have to do that.
And what, if anything, in terms of what we're seeing right now in Israel and Gaza, do you think that conflict can or should be remedied through diplomacy? What skills and what experiences of yours do you think are applicable, if any, to that conflict?
Well, one lesson that I mentioned in the book is that many people thought it was impossible to have peace in Colombia. After 50 years of war and so many so there is no conflict that cannot be solved. The first thing you need is to start the killings. That's why I think that at some time a ceasefire is necessary. But then you have to go to the roots of the problem. In the case of Palestine and Israel, well, this is a very old conflict, and my personal belief is that the two-state solution is still a viable solution if the other countries, the Arab countries and the powers like US, Russia, Europe, all agree that that can be imposed. I think that would be a good solution, to give the necessary guarantees to both sides for the future. You always have to not concentrate on the past, but think about the future. Unfortunately, in today's geopolitical difficult world, those type of cooperation among the big powers and among the different countries in the world has become more difficult. But I hope that with good leadership, and this is a very important word right now, we need much more determined and effective leadership in order to solve many of the problems that we have right now. We are lacking those leaders that take the initiatives and are capable of rallying the sufficient forces to make them become true. No world leader right now is exercising that type of leadership. And hopefully it would arise soon, because otherwise we will continue not only this war, not only the Ukraine war, but with the weakening of the multilateral system, we can see more wars.
And last one from you before I turn it over to Alexa to talk about multidimensional poverty. You know, you were the person before you, the Uribe administration, you know, definitely much more right-wing, much less receptive to the idea of negotiation. But I think more significantly, perhaps, your successor, Ivan Duque, also didn't row back on everything you did, but definitely in terms of rhetoric was critical, and I think I'm right in saying supported the no vote during the referendum of your. I mean, how does that feel? Did you feel that Winston Churchill was succeeded by Clement Attlee, and he felt that was a great betrayal? Did you feel somehow angered by that?
I even laugh. Why? Look what is happening right now. Right now. Uribe, my successor, wanted to make peace with the FARC. He wrote, and we published the letters that he wrote to the FARC saying, let's start a negotiation. He went with his peace commissioner to Cuba and sat down for more than a year with the other guerrilla group, the ELN. And then when we started the peace process with the FARC, he said, how can you sit down to negotiate with terrorists? He had already sat down with them. That's one small example. But right now, the Petro administration is negotiating something he called the total peace with different groups. And my predecessor, Uribe, appointed his delegates to 2 negotiations who have already accepted much more before they start negotiating than we accepted in the agreement with the FARC. So what does that mean? That his opposition to the peace process was purely political. He needed to be against the peace process because it's easy everywhere to criticize peace processes because peace processes are never perfect. You can always say, how can you put the perpetrators, instead of putting them in jail 40 years, you only give them 8 years. You always find ways to criticize. Every peace process. Mandela was criticized. Shimon Peres was killed. Prime Minister Rabin was killed because of the peace process. So it's always easy politically to go against peace process. So that's why I'm not sort of worried about that. My successor was simply an extension of Uribe, and he tried to what do you call it, when the derail the peace process, couldn't, because it's constitutionally protected. The pressure of the public opinion didn't allow it. He could not boycott it, but did not implement it. So politically, I'm not affected by that. When you think you're doing what is correct in government, in public service, that is the most important thing. When you're convinced that you are doing well, even if you're not right, you might be wrong, but if you think you're doing well, you don't get affected by those type of things.
So you've often talked about the ways that peace and poverty are interrelated, and establishing the multi-dimensional poverty index was a big part of your promotion of peace in Colombia. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to us about how you implemented it so early on in your presidency, and what do you think contributed to its success?
Well, yes. When you're in government, when I ran for president, you have to plan. What is it you want to do, your priorities. And I had an experience that showed me a new window. The day I was inaugurated, I went up in the mountains in the north of Colombia to our indigenous communities, called the Mamos, the Kogi community, to ask them for permission to go to Congress and be sworn in, as a gesture of recognition to our older brothers, our indigenous communities. That was, for them, a big surprise, accepted, and they gave me a mandate. He said, make peace with the FARC, but also make peace with nature. You will never have sustainable peace among humans if you don't make peace with nature. And Mother Nature is mad, and unfortunately you will suffer her fury very soon. And 1 week later, the worst national disaster that Colombia has had, the Niña phenomenon, hit Colombia, and I had to administer a flooded country for about 1.5 years. And I had no idea of how to administer that. I was not very much aware of climate change, to tell you the truth. I was not a denier, but I was not. And I summoned people from all around the world, among them Al Gore, to teach me about climate change and what is that we want to do. And that opened my mind and the governor's mind to the existential threat of climate change. And so we recreated, because my predecessor had eliminated the Ministry of the Environment. We recreated it, and we put in place a very aggressive environmental policy. And we simultaneously started something that many people don't know. Colombia was a country that first proposed the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, back in 2011. 2 marvelous young ladies from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs came to me and said, we have this idea. The Millennium Goals will expire in 2015, and they should be renewed, but with two new important elements: the environmental dimension, and that the developed countries also take responsibility. And I said, I think it's a good idea, I will support you. And my Minister of Foreign Affairs, she started making a marvelous work of multilateral diplomacy. We then I went personally to the Rio Summit, Rio Plus 20 Summit in 2012, made officially the proposal of the concept of the SDGs. They were accepted at this summit, that was in the United Nations conference, and we started a negotiation of how many and which objectives that ended with the 17 SDGs in the famous General Assembly in the United Nations in 2015, where for the first time not one single country even abstained. They all approved it. The number one SDGs is poverty, which was the basis of the Millennium Goals. So poverty was also, since the beginning, a priority for my government. And those coincidences in life, happy coincidence, I heard about the multidimensional index that had been discussed, inspired by a former teacher that I had many, many years ago at the London School of Economics, Amartya Sen. And I finally got in contact with a marvelous person who is here with us, that's Sabina Alcair, who was the one who, with James Foster, sort of put in black and white what this concept of the multi-dimensional poverty was. And we started working on that, of how to create an index for Colombia. In a nutshell, what this means is that instead of measuring poverty by how much you earn, you measure poverty by what are the sort of basic necessities that you are lacking that you can have in order to be considered non-poor. And that varies from one country to another. One of the very important tools or elements of this index is that it gives you some flexibility, but also gives you an indicator where you can concentrate your money, your resources, to have the biggest impact in fighting poverty. And so I had the opportunity of making the fight against poverty a priority, using the multi-dimensional index, and the results are there. I mean, I'm not inventing it. The poverty, also monetary poverty, and the old way of measuring in Colombia went down. Colombia was one of the countries that had the best performance in those 8 years of any country in Latin America, because of this index was really helpful for the government, to choose and concentrate on where you are going to have the impact. And at the same time, the SDGs and the environmental policy opened up a whole new world and a whole new role of what to do with the climate. And that became very important in my government also. So we had poverty, climate change, and peace. And we worked simultaneously, the three of them, and the three of them are connected in the world. That's what I tried to tell the Security Council 2 months ago. You must get involved with climate change, because climate change is exacerbating conflicts around the world. The floods in Pakistan, the fires in California, the droughts in Sahara, all that is exacerbating conflicts. The Security Council and the United Nations was created to avoid conflict, to promote peace. Therefore, logical conclusion, you must get involved. But because of geopolitics, Russia and China objected, because the United States said yes. That is one of the big problems we have in the world right now. Lack of consensus, lack of rationality to understand that if we all of us, don't make a much stronger effort to reverse climate change, to reverse global warming, we will all perish. As simple as that. And because of petty politics, even here, the UK, and the UK was the champion, one of the champions of the cause of stopping global warming and climate change. Somebody who lives very near here, Desmond Cameron, was the one who negotiated with us the SDGs. And now we're seeing the UK rolling back, France rolling back, Germany rolling back, the United States rolling back. Why? Because they have elections. That is a big mistake. At this time, if we don't double down in terms of our fight to have peace with nature, then we will be in big trouble. So we did what we could do in our government, those 8 years. We did not do enough. You never do enough in government. Well, we did what we could, and we have to keep on struggling.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing you say there is really interesting, that because of, leaders can prioritize these short-term electoral ambitions over longer-term challenges. And in your event yesterday, I thought it was really interesting how you talked about the issue of drugs and how you actually now would do away with the prohibition, and how surprised some of your citizens were to hear that.
Yes, and again, you learn by experience. I grew in a country that has been the country that has suffered the most of any country in the world in this war on drugs that was declared 70 years ago. Colombia has put more blood, more dead, and more violence than any other country in this war on drugs. And I grew in that country. And because of that, I was a very hardliner. And when I became Minister of Defense, I said, I'm going to fight this drug traffickers and drug trafficking with everything I have. So I, as Minister of Defense, ordered the helicopters to spray the coca fields, and I sprayed more coca fields than any president in the history of the world. I signed more extradition of drug lords, of drug traffickers to the United States than any president in the history of the world. I signed 1,450 drug traffickers extradited to jails in the United States. And at the end, I felt like I was in a static bicycle. Pedaling, I look to the right, we're in the same place. Look to the left, we're in the same place. So I said, this is not working. We have to change this war. This war that in this part of the world, Latin America, and also in Africa, is feeding something which is doing away with democracies. Organized crime and insecurity is growing from Mexico to Argentina, and in Africa also. And what is the solution? I start saying, what is the solution? If you read what happened in the United States 100 years ago with what they did with the liquor when liquor was prohibited, the discussions are exactly the same that we are having right now with the drug issue. And so I changed. I evolved from being a hardliner to now I am part of something called the Global Commission on Drug Policy. And as president, I said we need to legalize drugs. We need to regulate drugs. The only way to be effective against the organized crime that controls the drug trade. I was very much criticized by that because it's one of those issues that are so easy to use from a populist point of view. And I suffered the consequences. I remember my political adversary saying, President Santos, he wants to poison our kids. He wants to give drugs to our kids. And I went to a restaurant and the mothers said, President Santos, are you crazy? And I had to make meetings like this one with the mothers, and I asked, are you a mother? Yes, I am a mother. How many kids do you have? I have 3 kids. What are your kids? Boy or girl? He's caught with drugs. Would you prefer him or her to be thrown in jail or to go to an institution that will help her with the problem? Oh, of course, an institution that will help her. Well, that's exactly what I'm trying to propose. Oh, why didn't you not explain that better? And it's that type of dilemma. But when you are convinced that what you're doing is correct, you keep on, and so I kept on. It's been difficult, but slowly, this is something that people are accepting more and more. So this is an example of leadership that you need to go against the current, against things that are in the short run very unpopular. But when you think or you are convinced that this is the correct thing to do, which I am convinced, then you have to do it.
Yes, the white shirt.
Hi, I'm Diana. I'm from Lady Margaret Hall, and I work in global youth mental health. So I've seen a lot of intergenerational trauma and suffering, and I was wondering if you have seen any situations that make these sort of intergenerational trauma worse, and how you have seen healing happen in communities.
You have what?
Yeah, so she works in mental health. She's Lady Margaret Hall, and she's wondering if there's anything, if she's seen intergenerational trauma. So trauma for communities that gets passed on through generations. And could you describe your experience of seeing that, and if that gets worse or if that gets better?
With war?
Yes. In your case, yeah.
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. For example, what is happening right now with Gaza. When you ask the Israeli military, what is your objective? And they say, to do away with Hamas. And they say, okay, and how do you define doing away with Hamas? They might say, this is a theoretical question, they might say, until every of the leaders is dead or until any of this militia is dead. But then you can say, Hamas is a militia, but it's an idea, it's a cause. And all the sons and daughters of the people who were killed will grow up with the idea much stronger. So are you doing away with Hamas, or are you strengthening Hamas in the long run? That type of dilemmas are very, very common during wars. What is it that you have to do? That's why reconciliation is so important. And reconciliation can take generations. I remember during the peace process in Colombia, I went a couple of times, many times, to Rome, to the Vatican. And I talked to the Pope. He is from Argentina. We we had met, and we talked about the support that the church should give the peace process. And I said, why don't you go to Colombia? And one time he said, Mr. President, I pray a lot for you. And I said, my God, I should be in big trouble, because if the Pope needs to pray, and I will go to Colombia, but I will go when you and the Colombian people will most need me. And he chose to go after we signed the peace agreement, after the guerrillas laid down and gave their weapons to the United Nations. He then went to Colombia. And he himself put a name on his trip to Colombia. I go to Colombia to push the Colombians on the first step in this very long road of reconciliation, which is, he was so right. Every peace process has two phases. One is peace building, one is peacemaking, and the other one is peace building. Peacemaking is when you negotiate and you agree, and peacemaking is when you reconcile, when you precisely stop the hatred that generations of wars have created. And that reconciliation is extremely difficult. You need to heal wounds, you need to be educational, you need to bring people together, and that might take more than one generation. But if you don't do it, that would perpetuate. And there are good examples. You go to Rwanda, they are playing, the kids are playing football together, and the ones that were at war. You have good examples, but you need to do that, and you need to do that for a long time, for a society to reconcile. Otherwise, you probably know that better than I do, the other generations will continue with the war inside their hearts.
Another question?
Hi, I'm David from Exeter College, también de Bogotá. So my question is, technologies are very important nowadays across the country, and their development is deeply related to STEM fields, science, maths. Do you think the Department of Education in Colombia should prioritize education of STEM-related fields in order to modernize Colombia?
Yes, I think, but it's not mutually exclusive. You can give technology much more importance, and of course technology is having a bigger effect in our whole lives and in our education. But my answer would be that the more you can use technology to reinforce your educational objectives, the better. We had an experience of giving laptops to the poorest families. That is part of this struggle to fight poverty. And the effect of the laptops in the families that started using laptops was incredibly positive. Incredibly positive. Like the effect that it had, there was a program called Ser Pilo Paga, which means if you are a good student, that will pay. We took the students that had the best exams from the poorest families, and they went to the best universities. That changed the lives of many thousands and thousands of families, simply because one member of the family could go to a good university. Same thing with technology, laptops. or other use of technology. You can use it in a good way, but you could use it also in a bad way. That is the big question now with artificial intelligence. What do we do with artificial intelligence? The logical answer is, if we all agree to use it in a good way, that would be great. But if it's used in a bad way, that could destroy us. That is why artificial intelligence was included recently in the list of existential threats to humanity. Because if it is used in a bad way, it could destroy us. So it depends on how you are going to use technology, but I would say that the answer to your question is yes. Give technology a lot of importance, but not at the expense of other important educational elements. You still have to, we're human beings, we still have to have principles, values, basic education, history. That's why I say they're not mutually exclusive.
Hi, my name is Ivana. I'm at Christchurch College. I was wondering if you would support the rise in support for direct cash contributions in very poor communities, because as you said, political leaders will change their goals when they need to be elected and might become quite disconnected from what the people really need, whereas if you give cash directly to these communities, they can actually get what they feel they need and build up their communities in a far more effective manner than a sort of paternalistic government doing so.
Okay.
Yes, I think this actually connects to what you were speaking about in the battle against poverty. So that's, I think it's a really interesting question. He was asking about direct cash payments.
Oh.
So, do you think direct cash payments in some instances can be more effective in reducing poverty? And I think in your book, to add on to your question, but in your book you mentioned that you came under a lot of criticism for some of the programs you undertook by people saying, how do you know this money is going to be spent well? How do you know people aren't just going to waste this money and we won't? But I think you had a good experience with those payments.
Cash payments, direct cash payments, with certain conditionalities, I think they are very positive. They're very, very good. I copied a bit of what Brazil did, Bolsa Familia program, giving some cash, but provided that the kids went to school and had access to the health system. So it's a way to stimulate the introduction of especially the kids in the formal system. So in that way, yes. By giving cash with no conditions, I think in the long run it could be counterproductive. There's a moral hazard there. The experience in our case was relatively positive, and I will continue with that program.
I think only a few more minutes left, but let us know when you need to go. Yes, this gentleman in the black coat.
Hello, my name is Julian from Green Templeton College, and I have a bit of a personal question. When you received the Nobel Prize for Peace, how did you personally feel? What it meant to you, and did it change something in your efforts as well?
I was sleeping. And I was so asleep that there had been a football game the day before. Brazil were Saturday, and I had a couple of drinks in it, so I was very asleep. And somebody from Europe called, the Nobel Committee called the President's Palace, but they had instructions. I don't want to be woken up. So they couldn't get to me. Somebody heard the news here in Europe, in Paris, called my son. And my son then told the operator of the palace, no, you have to put me to my father. And he finally got it. I said, hello, and my son said, Dad, you won the Nobel Peace. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll see you later. But then I realized what happened. Well, of course, I had just lost a referendum 5 days before. The referendum I put the peace process in the referendum and I lost it. A small percentage, but I lost it. And I was starting to renegotiate the peace process, the peace agreement, in order to put it to Congress, which was what the Constitution stipulated. And the first thing I thought is, this is going to help me tremendously in the renegotiation of the people. This is like it's going to be concentrated like the backing of the international community for the approval of the peace process. And of course I felt very happy and personally very excited. When I went, I said to the Nobel Committee and people in Oslo, where, as a matter of fact, I'm going tomorrow, and the recipient of this is not me. It's people like the story I told you about Pastora Mira. I took her to Oslo. It is the victims. This prize is not for me, it's for the victims. They are the ones who deserve the Nobel Prize. But it did help a lot in the negotiation. Of course, it's a tremendous honor. There's a famous Chilean writer that says, there are many former presidents, but not too many former Nobel Peace Laureates. So I feel very proud of being a Nobel laureate.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Francisco from Sandhurst College. Thank you for the talk. Well, my question is regarding more to the situation that we also face in Mexico. Mexico has seen a situation with now drug cartels and some solutions you have mentioned are the legalization of drugs. And I also believe that there are some other aspects in the structural problems that could be addressed. So in your experience, what sectors will actually be developed in order to focus on the solution of drug cartels legalization? Thank you.
Well, I remember when he was recently elected, your president, López Obrador, in Mérida. We were in Mérida and we sat down and he asked me about negotiations with the drug cartels. And I told him a story that I had, my experience. When I was a journalist, many years before, the most powerful drug cartel in the world, the Medellin cartel, was sitting down with the former president of Colombia, López, in Panama, secretly. And I got word of that. The cartel had just assassinated the Minister of Justice a week before. So I said, this is not acceptable. And I published the news, and that was a big scandal. Many years later, the other Nobel laureate of Colombia, Garcia Marquez, writer, came to my house and said, have you thought of how much blood and how many dead you would have saved if you had not published and denounced this negotiation with the cartel? And I said to him, I was a good friend, I said to him, this is a very unjust question. Why are you asking this right now? And he said, because we're negotiating with the then president, his name was Barco, the release of the sister of the Secretary General of the presidency. His name was Germán Montoya. And we want to ask you if you're going to publish that, or if you get news, or can you keep it secret? And I said, I can very well keep it secret. It is, on the contrary, it should be secret, but be careful. You are who you are negotiating with. A week later, they killed her. Why do I tell you this story? Because I told this story to López Obrador, and I told him, be careful with your policy of abrazos y no balazos. If you are going to negotiate with criminal groups, I have no problem with negotiating, but you cannot negotiate only with a carrot. You have to have a carrot and a stick, especially with criminal groups. But in general, the human condition is not that, even though, as I told you, I learned about the human condition, my appreciation of the human condition increased, but it's not as good as to say that the criminal mafias of Mexico or of Colombia are going to be so generous as to give away a business that makes such huge profits. And what has happened in Colombia proves it. We have dismantled, we killed the main cartel leaders, we killed Pablo Escobar, we killed or put in jail the Cali cartel, and they're still there. They're replaced. So, again, the only, in my view, least, the lesser evil, because that's what you have to do. There's no perfect solution. The lesser evil is go after the drug cartels, but at the same time go after their money by legalizing the business.
I think that is all we have time for, but just once again, thank you so much, President Juan Manuel Santos, for joining us today.